Here is something I keep returning to, and I cannot make it stop bothering me. Antarctica, the coldest, driest, most hostile landmass on Earth, was once covered in forest, not scattered scrub, not primitive moss. Dense, ancient forest with trees that grew in complete polar darkness for months at a time. That fact alone is not the mystery. Science has known it for decades, and the explanation is clear and well-reasoned. Continental drift, shifting poles, the slow migration of tectonic plates across geological time. 250 million years ago, Antarctica was part of Gondwana, a supercontinent positioned near the equator. It had warmth, it had rainfall, it had trees that stood in temperate forest for millions of years before the continent slowly drifted south and the ice came. The mainstream account of that ancient world is detailed, reproducible, and entirely persuasive. I am not dismissing it. This piece does not work if I dismiss it. Most people hear that explanation and nod. It fits the geological model cleanly. It doesn't ask us to revise anything we think we know. And I want to be clear, I am not quarrelling with paleoclimatology. The researchers who reconstructed those ancient ecosystems did careful, rigorous work, and their conclusions are genuinely extraordinary. But here is where I need you to follow me carefully, because the problem is not the ancient forest. The problem is what has been found within its fossilized remains, and what the documentary record does immediately afterward, which is go very quiet, in a very specific, very consistent way. In 2017, a team led by Erik Gulbranson of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee excavated fossilized trees in the Transantarctic Mountains within a few hundred miles of the South Pole. These were not impressions or trace fragments. These were intact fossilized trunks with preserved growth rings and cellular structure, trees that had genuinely stood. The trees belonged to species that had adapted to grow through polar darkness, months without sunlight, and still thrived. Their growth rings showed rapid seasonal cycles. Gulbranson's team dated them to approximately 260 million years ago, placing them at the very end of the Permian period, just before the Great Extinction. The discovery was reported. It circulated briefly through science journalism, and then it faded. Not erased, not dramatically suppressed, just quietly backgrounded by the news cycle, filed under interesting geology, and left to gather the kind of dust that only accumulates on things no one is actively encouraged to revisit. I want to sit with that carefully, because faded from public attention is not itself evidence of anything. Things fade all the time. Science moves through journals and conferences, not sustained media cycles. I know this. I am not pretending that obscurity automatically equals suppression. I hold that distinction carefully. But the fossilized forest is not the only part of this story that goes quiet. It is not an isolated case of scientific discovery being absorbed into the background. It is one point in a set of points, and the set, when laid out in sequence, has a shape I cannot easily ignore. Go back further. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis produced a map that still exists in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. The map is real, it is documented. It depicts a southern landmass with a coastline that several researchers have argued corresponds to the Antarctic coast beneath the ice sheet. The mainstream response to that claim is swift and reasonable. The map is a compilation of older sources, the southern landmass is speculative, and the resemblance to Antarctica is partial and imprecise. These are fair objections. The Piri race map has been embraced by enough credulous writers that serious researchers are understandably reluctant to engage it. I accept that reluctance, but I raise the map not as proof of anything, only to show that the question of a once temperate Antarctic landscape surfaces across a very long timeline in cartography, in the fossil record, in geophysical surveys. That pattern of surfacing and of being set aside is itself something worth noticing. I want to stay on undisputed ground, because the undisputed ground is already strange enough to warrant serious attention. What follows are not speculative claims. Every name, date, document, and institution I am about to describe is real, documented, and a matter of public record. I need you to hold on to that. In 1946, the United States Navy launched Operation Highjump. This is not contested by anyone. It was the largest Antarctic expedition ever assembled, 4,700 men, 13 ships and 33 aircraft, commanded by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, the most celebrated polar explorer in American history at that time. The stated mission was training and cartographic survey. The planned duration was 6 to 8 months. What is also documented in declassified Navy records, in Byrd's own public statements, is that the expedition was cut short after approximately 8 weeks. Byrd ordered a withdrawal. The official explanation was weather and logistical difficulty. Those explanations are plausible. Antarctica in winter does not accommodate schedules, and no polar expedition is immune to environmental disruption. I want to hold that clearly. The withdrawal alone proves nothing. It is what surrounds the withdrawal, the language used afterward, the absence of a second mission, that begins to press against an explanation. In March 1947, an interview with Byrd was published in the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio. In it, Byrd warned that the United States needed to guard against an enemy capable of attacking from pole to pole. The interview is real. It is in the public record. The quote is not disputed. The standard interpretation is that Byrd was speaking generally about Cold War threats, that his language was dramatic, but not literally about Antarctic. That reading is possible. It requires accepting that a man who had just cut short the largest Antarctic expedition in American history was speaking in vague generalities about the Soviet threat. Maybe, but the timing sits strangely. The withdrawal sits strangely, and the absence of a major follow-up expedition, despite the Navy's stated strategic interest in Antarctic presence, sits strangely too. I am not saying those three things add up to a proof. I am saying they do not add up to silence. What I cannot as easily set aside is what happened 12 years later. It is not an absence of action, which can always be attributed to inertia or budget constraints or competing priorities. It is a positive action, deliberate, international, and coordinated, that raises its own specific questions. In 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty, placing the entire continent under a framework of scientific cooperation and controlled access. No military installations, no resource extraction, and, this matters structurally, no independent, unmediated presence. Every party operating in Antarctica does so under the collective oversight of the signatory nations. Those signatories now number 56. Among them, the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Argentina, nations that have spent the intervening decades competing bitterly over every other piece of strategically valuable terrain on Earth, nations that agree on almost nothing without years of fractious negotiation. On Antarctica, they agree completely. That unanimity is what I keep returning to. Not because international agreement is impossible, nations do cooperate, sometimes, but because the speed and completeness of this particular agreement is historically unusual for nations with competing territorial claims, competing ideologies, and actively competing intelligence services. The treaty was signed in 1959. The Cold War was not over. I want to take the most charitable interpretation of that seriously, because it is genuinely compelling. The treaty works partly because Antarctica is genuinely difficult to exploit. The logistics are brutal. The climate is extreme. There may simply be nothing there worth fighting over that could not be obtained more cheaply somewhere else. International cooperation on inhospitable terrain is not unprecedented. Outer space operates under similar logic. The Outer Space Treaty governs spacefaring nations with surprising consistency, and no one treats that as evidence of a cover-up. You could make the case that Antarctica and outer space both represent environments where difficulty forces cooperation that self-interest alone never would. That argument is coherent, and I respect it. But the access restrictions built into the Antarctic Treaty are not incidental features of scientific cooperation. They are structural. You cannot go to Antarctic as a private party and begin independent excavation. You need national sponsorship, program affiliation, and approval from treaty bodies. This is explained as environmental protection. Perhaps it is exactly that, but it is also, structurally, an efficient mechanism for controlling what gets found, where it gets found, and how the findings are reported. Those two purposes, environmental protection and controlled access, are not mutually exclusive. They coexist very comfortably. The BEDMAP project, a fully documented international initiative, has used ice-penetrating radar to produce detailed maps of the terrain beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet. Those maps show ancient river valleys, drainage systems, and topographies that, under different thermal conditions, would fall within the climate band capable of supporting boreal forest. Not speculatively. That is the output of mainstream geophysical research, published in peer-reviewed journals, conducted by teams affiliated with major international institutions. The land beneath the ice, if the ice were removed and temperatures normalized, would, in certain regions, support vegetation. That is not a fringe conclusion. It is the scientific consensus. I am not saying that the current subglacial terrain supports living forest. The ice is real. The cold is catastrophic. I am saying something narrower, that the most geologically interesting subglacial terrain happens to be located in the most access-controlled regions of the continent. That correspondence may be coincidence, but it has a shape. If you were designing a system to ensure something remained undiscovered, not through conspiracy, but through structural impediment, you would design something that looks very much like the Antarctic Treaty framework combined with the institutional gatekeeping of international research programs. I am not saying that was the intent. I am asking you to notice the shape. Here is the counter-argument I keep returning to. There is no named actor in this story, no smoking document, no single architect of whatever silence may or may not exist here. And the correct epistemological response to a pattern without a named architect is to seriously question whether the pattern is real or constructed. I apply that skepticism to myself. The human mind is a pattern-finding machine, and it will find patterns in noise if given enough data points and enough motivation. The fact that I find a shape in these events does not mean the shape was placed there by anyone with intent or purpose. I hold that with both hands. But I am not describing a conspiracy. I am describing something more ordinary, and in many ways more durable: institutional logic. Governments do not need to coordinate explicitly to produce uniform behavior when uniform behavior serves all of them equally well. The alignment does not need to be planned. It needs only to be rational. Scientific institutions do not need to be instructed to underreport findings that would create politically inconvenient questions about their own access agreements. Researchers operating inside treaty-governed frameworks have structural incentives to stay within the lines of what the framework validates. That is not corruption. It is the ordinary operation of institutional gravity. Silence does not require organization. It requires only that the cost of speaking exceed the cost of not speaking, for enough people, in enough positions, for long enough. When that condition holds, silence becomes the default output of a system. No individual is responsible for producing it. There is no center to expose. And this, I think, is what makes the silence around Antarctica different from ordinary scientific obscurity. It is not that Antarctica is ignored. It is that the attention it receives is precisely calibrated, precisely managed, and precisely distributed through institutions with a shared interest in the controlled production of what Antarctica means to the world. What would falsify what I am suggesting? I force myself to ask that question, because without an answer, I am not reasoning. I am pattern matching in the dark. The honest answer is full, unmediated, independent scientific access to the subglacial terrain, published without treaty body review, by researchers with no institutional affiliation to any signatory nation. That would either find nothing and close the question cleanly, or it would find something and a very different set of questions would open. Neither outcome is likely to arrive soon. Antarctic research is expensive, dangerous, and necessarily institutional. I know that. I am not pretending that logistics are inherently sinister, but I notice that the very features of Antarctic research that make it necessarily institutional are also the features that make independent verification structurally impossible. Those two facts, the logistical necessity and the resulting institutional monopoly, are not in tension with each other. They are mutually reinforcing, and the reinforcement is total. The fossil record confirms that forest existed in Antarctica. The BEDMAP surveys confirm that the terrain could support vegetation under different conditions. The treaty confirms that independent verification is structurally impeded, and the history of institutions confirms that when the cost of a finding exceeds the cost of its suppression, suppression becomes the rational default. Not through conspiracy, not through a decision made in a named room by named people, through the quiet, collective, institutional preference for a world that remains in the shape we already know how to manage. That preference requires no malice. It requires only the ordinary workings of self-preservation operating at institutional scale. I don't know what is under the ice. That is the only sentence I have at the end of this that I can say with complete honesty. I do not know. No document I have found answers it. No researcher I have read publicly claims to know. The question sits entirely open. The researchers are careful. The treaty nations are cooperative. The science, as far as it extends, is legitimate, reproducible, and not obviously falsified. I hold all of that. I am not accusing anyone of a specific act of wrongdoing. I want to be very precise about that distinction because it matters, but as far as it extends is doing enormous work in that sentence. And the question of how far it extends, who decides where it stops, and what exists in the geography just beyond that border, those questions do not have answers in any publicly available document I have found, which either means there is genuinely nothing there worth protecting, and the silence is simply the unremarkable result of a continent that has nothing remarkable left to offer beyond what has already been mapped. That is the simplest explanation, and I want to give it the weight it deserves. Or it means the document that would answer this has not been written yet, that the findings are still accumulating, still being processed through the slow machinery of institutional science, and that whatever is there, will eventually surface through the ordinary channels in the ordinary time without anyone having hidden anything. Or it means it has been written somewhere, quietly sitting in an ordinary cabinet in an ordinary office, in the kind of bureaucratic stillness that is indistinguishable from emptiness unless you already know what you are looking for. I don't know which of those possibilities is true. I find that I am not comfortable with not knowing. I am standing at the edge of a very large, very cold, very quiet continent, and the map I have been given, official, treaty-approved, carefully maintained by 56 nations, ends precisely where the most interesting questions begin. I don't know what is beyond it. I am not sure we are meant to.